Right, but there's this camera.
John, can you hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, we had a little bit of technical difficulties. Apologies for that. It has been a long morning, but it will be a thrilling afternoon, I promise you that. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker, John McWhorter. John teaches linguistics, American studies, and music history at Columbia University. He earned his BA from Rutgers, MA from New York University, and PhD in linguistics from Stanford. John is the author of over 20 books, including The Power of Babel, Losing the Race, and Our Magnificent Bastard Tongues. In 2021, he published not one but two books, 9 Nasty Words and Woke Racism, How the New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. John also regularly contributes to countless newspapers and magazines, including Time, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Chronicle of Higher Education, The Atlantic, and many more. Furthermore, he does a fascinating language podcast called Lexicon Valley and is a regular on the Glenn Lurie podcast on racism called The Glenn Show. Recently, John and Jordan Peterson recorded a conversation titled How Anti-Racism is Hurting Black America. I just mentioned that one because it was posted on YouTube on my birthday. Thanks for that. John asked me to not make him sound like all he ever does is write grouchy conservative things about race. Grouchy probably is contradicted by him recently appearing on Real Time with Bill Maher and actually being much more funny than Bill. And so I'll just say he writes really interesting, smart, at times also really funny things about language and race, things that we all should pay attention to. So in this spirit, it is my great pleasure to give the virtual floor to John McWhorter about Not For Us to Say, Working Through and Past Conflation of Radicalism with Inquiry.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for having me, folks, and thank you, Christina. I want to explore the topic by starting with something I usually don't, which is aspects of my personal story. And that is that with the kind of linguistics that I do, it's been rather a sad tale that I don't talk about in public much for various reasons, but it's getting to the point where the matter is so extreme and so clearly connected to something larger, which is what makes something interesting, that it's time to start telling it. And that is that a lot of the linguistics that I do is focused on Creole languages, such as Haitian Creole, Papiamentu, Cape Verdean Creole, Jamaican Patois. All of those are the same linguistic phenomenon manifesting itself in various places. And I found Creole languages fascinating from when I was introduced to what linguistics was. And there is an interesting story to these languages, which is that they are languages of survival and creativity. So what happens usually is that, for example, slaves who are adults and are past the time when most people can learn a language completely, especially when it's not being taught explicitly, were brought to a plantation setting. The slaves spoke many different languages, and they were given fragments of, say, English or French or Spanish, and they had to make a language out of this. The first thing that happens is a pidgin, which is not a language. It's a lingo that you use just to get by. But if that's what everybody is communicating in for the rest of their lives, then the pidgin expands. You use the limited vocabulary, you use the limited grammatical structures, and you make new things. And after a while, you have a brand new language, and that's called a Creole, whether it's based on French, Spanish, Portuguese, or any other language. It's not just what happens in Louisiana and Haiti. So a Creole language, where language gets broken, and then it's built up again into a new language. I and various people came into the field in our 20s, in the late 80s, wanting to explore that process, its history, what's going on in the languages today, the idea being that pidgins became Creoles. And people like me have gradually realized that the people who do what's called Creole studies mostly are not committed to what we were. Gradually, we found that we were surrounded by people with a mission completely alien to ours. We wanted to explore how Creole languages develop. Almost everybody in Creole studies, though, is actually committed, although they wouldn't say it in so many words. And I don't think many of them know that it's anything to be said. But what they're interested in is not exploration. They're interested in advocacy. What they're interested in is showing that Creoles are real languages and defending Creoles from discrimination. Now, Creole languages have often been discriminated against. It's easy to think they're not real because they're not usually written, because they are not as ridiculously grammatically complex as older languages end up being in spite of themselves. So there is an avocational mission that's necessary. But with most people in the field, that's really all they're doing. And if you say anything that goes against that advocational mission in their eyes, in their ears, then you're treated as a heretic. You're not doing the right thing, and you attract not just criticism, but condemnation, really knit brows, social ostracization, and these days with social media being called names on Twitter and on Facebook. And among the names are, of course, racist, and yes, even if you're Black like me. And as I've looked back on how Creole studies has gone for me, and frankly, I am one of the players in it. It's not as if I had been completely pushed out of the sandbox, but I am seen with a gimlet eye by most of the people in the field, and I wouldn't want to hear some of the things that they probably say behind my back. I realized that I ran up very early against the sort of people that I wrote about last year in my book, Woke Racism. I call them the elect. That doesn't seem to be catching on, and so maybe we can call them the hyper woke or whatever you want to call them. But that group of people that ended up taking on such amazing influence starting in the spring of 2020, some people have asked me, well, how do you know about these people? Because I talk about how they're unreachable. I talk about what it's like to talk to these people, what the difficulties are in getting things across to these people, and frankly, in trying to be a person committed to inquiry when fields are increasingly led by people of that frame of mind. And the truth is that the reason I feel so confident in pronouncing about what these people are like and why they're like it and what to do about them is because I've known them for now 25 years plus. It's not that they only came into existence in 2020. And so I think probably all of us in this room are familiar with this sort of person who is committed to battling differentials in power, and especially white power, over everything else. And they have an idea that that is what inquiry needs to be focused on. And they're so sure of this that they don't even think of it as a position. But it means that you're in trouble if you're committed to just inquiry for its own sake, especially if what you find upon making such inquiry are things that aren't compatible with the idea that the only things worth saying and the only things worth spreading are the things that combat power differentials. And so it means that in linguistics in general, people like me and Steven Pinker, you heard from earlier today, are seeing a gradual takeover of the field. What scares me is that increasing numbers of people like this are graying at the temples. It really is a takeover of the field where you are not to inquire, you are to advocate, and you're to toe a certain political line. And the things that you see can seem senseless until you realize that it's all based on the same essential sense that not inquiry is important, but battling power differentials is important, although you in your language call that inquiry. That's what makes all these things so hard to cut through. And so it's chilling unless you realize that it's all coming from the same place, and then it still is. The Linguistic Society of America right now is in the middle of a heated battle. And what happened is that about a month ago, the so-called leaders of the LSA decided to propose that the LSA operate according to the University of Chicago free speech principles, which would seem to be a relatively innocent thing. And as all of this was discussed in chat sections, etc., what one saw is a great many brilliant, serious, and earnest people deeply offended that the LSA would consider adopting these principles because the call to adopt them was interpreted as a statement against a movement that's now in its third year to defrock Steven Pinker of the honors that the society has given him over the years. The reason being that Steven Pinker has said some things that these people consider not woke enough about race, and then there are also some issues with purported sexism as well. I think most reasonable people looking at the charges against him would see that something was afoot that reminds you more of China's Cultural Revolution than cool-headed reason today in the West. But nevertheless, all of these people, all of these fundamentally good people really felt we cannot adopt these free speech principles because then we can't witch hunt Steven Pinker. All of this was said straight. None of these people realize how ironic this was. And you just see one thing after another. And so one more thing about Creoles, and then I promise I won't mention them ever again. One of the leading scientists of Creole studies is a native Haitian. And his commitment is less to describing Haitian Creole than to advocating for it. He was invited by the LSA to give a keynote talk. That in itself was a decision typical of the modern LSA, given that he's been quite abusive to many people over the years, but he was invited because of reasons I think we all know. And I kid you not, that he gave his keynote speech in Haitian Creole with minimal interpretation into English. So he actually sat there for 45 minutes speaking a language that no one in the audience knew but him and maybe one other person, and only gave the dimmest of understanding of it in any other way, except that there was somebody translating it into American Sign Language, and that's great, but let's face it, most hearing people don't know that language. And this actually happened. And the idea was to show that Haitian Creole is a real language and therefore can be the vehicle of a serious public address. Well, okay, that statement was made. The fact that no one understood it was considered less important than the gesture itself. That's something that you would almost expect to see in a Christopher Guest movie, yet this actually happened a few months ago because of this kind of ideology. And so, increasingly, people like me who consider themselves to be on the left, but not the left, are called fascist. You notice the spread of the use of that word these days. And I wasn't aware that I had much in common with Mussolini or Hitler in terms of any of my views. I wasn't aware that I thought that society should be run from the top by people utterly unconcerned with the personal feelings of those down below, all of the things that fascism is. I wasn't aware that anything that I've ever proposed had anything to do with fascism as we know it. However, it makes a certain sense that that's becoming the term of art on the left for people on the left who aren't as left as them, because what they're thinking about is always this issue of power. If you're not battling power differentials, and particularly the power that is exerted by white people and especially white men, then it means that you're okay with a senseless and pitiless kind of hegemony from above that those below, the subalterns, have to suffer under. Therefore, the fascism becomes an understandable metaphor. But this is the kind of frame of mind that we're up against. And why I'm going on about that at a certain length, and I'm almost finished on that, is that I think that our tendency to frame this as a matter of a threat to free speech is one that people like this are not capable of understanding, and therefore can't foster anything like a real debate with them, if one is possible. And I think that to think of it as a matter of free speech also deprives us of being able to understand clearly the nature of what we're up against, which is not just that there's certain people who need to be made to understand that people should be able to express their opinions and that there's a marketplace of ideas. That won't work here. And I think understanding what's really going on in these people's minds will make that clear, especially since what's going on in their minds is actually in itself rather simple, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't create problems. Basically, the idea is that if you are an intellectual, if you are a meaningful academic, it certainly won't do for you to just explore. That's almost immoral, because for them, there is this hegemony from above that's always been there since civilization existed. We now have an awareness of a sort that means that maybe we can throw off those fetters forever. And that, in the name of what they call social justice, is absolutely important. And that, therefore, is what any moral sense in our lifetimes has to be of what inquiry is. It took me a couple of decades to fully understand what that kind of person meant, that you're sitting there being a nerd. You are somebody who went to Montessori and Quaker schools like I did. You just want to have fun and find out interesting things. And here's this person who has the same credentials as you. And what they're committed to doing is battling power differentials, shaking their fist at the sky. And to them, that is the most interesting thing to do. They assume, especially if you're Black, that that's what you're interested in doing. They're perplexed and even irritated to see that that's not what you're doing. And these are people who increasingly are the ones running our universities. Now, to give them the most credit that I can, I imagine that they suppose that this extremely limited sense of what inquiry is necessary now that we're going to get the white hegemony out of the way, and then we can be curious. Then we can just be, say, naturalists, etc. Then we can actually look at the world and enjoy wonder. But until we get rid of these power differentials, everything else is trivial, and it's almost unjust to focus on it because people are suffering. I imagine that's the way that they think about it. But it means that they are speaking a completely different language than we are. It's not about free speech. It's not about them trying to control language. They're thinking in a very different way. And that means that when they say critique, I remember being a young academic and thinking of these people and their critiques and thinking, wow, wonder, what wide range of things they're going to do in leveling this criticism. But then for them, critique is the critique of power differentials, not the critique of anything else. If you interrogate something, what you're interrogating is whiteness, not anything else. They wouldn't think of it any other way. To problematize is not to find a problem. It's a much narrower sense for them. To problematize is to find a problem with something white people are doing. And so one is to understand, if somebody is said to drink, you know that that means alcohol. That's how that expression has conventionalized. For them, critique and interrogation and problematizing are about battling the white power, as opposed to the wider meanings of those terms. And none of this seems at all narrow to them. It seems like the ultimate. That's what they do. That's what their purpose is. They didn't come into academia to explore things. They came into academia to shake things up and to fight the power. And the problem comes in because there are probably more of us in academia and related fields who really are just curious nerds. These people, however, have both a unique charisma and a very narrow kind of agenda. But it means that what seems irrational in them actually makes a kind of sense. I mean, especially over the past 3 years, we've seen all sorts of ideas acquire a purchase that we would never have expected. So math is racist. Music theory is racist, and Beethoven was only a modestly talented composer. That has come from an essay that's being passed around in music departments across the country and being, quote unquote, taken seriously. Punctuality is racist. Standard dialects of languages are racist. Remedial education is racist because education is already racist. The bar exam is racist, and on and on and on. All of this seems like, the man who has a hammer sees everything as a nail. Maybe, but then on the other hand, what we're really dealing with is people who just feel that there could be no more urgent reason of being on this earth than battling social injustice that involves these power differentials. And so we're dealing with this. And somebody who has a really good take on a lot of what makes discussion so difficult these days, and I would add, frankly, in some cases, impossible, is a series of fallacies that she outlines. Her name is Alana Redstone, and she's at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she has an article actually now in Tablet where you can find these, but she's been writing about this for some years. And she talks about the settled question fallacy, the fallacy of equal knowledge, and the fallacy of known intent. And the way I see them is that they're nested. I don't know if she sees it this way. But one of the fundamental problems is the idea that there is a settled question when really reasonable minds could disagree. So there's the idea, for example, that what we need to do most of all is battle power differentials. For people like this, that is a settled question. Everything is racism. There is no question about that. They consider that to be just established. That is as sacrosanct as E equals MC squared. So for them, it's just where do you go from there? And of course, there's a very limited place to go from there. They don't see it that way. But then there's the fallacy of equal knowledge. So the more patient among them will assume that if you don't share their sense of what a settled question is, then it's just that there's knowledge that you don't have, that you need to be taught. And so next comes the idea that we need constant teach-ins about the nature of systemic racism, about the history of racism in the United States and beyond, that people need to be taught, because certainly if they're taught, then they will agree with this apparently settled question. And then comes the fallacy of known intent, which is that people like this, if you are given these facts and yet still don't agree, they assume that you must be evil. It must be that you have malevolent intent. And here comes the idea so common among people like this, that there is this agenda that people against them have, the idea being to preserve white hegemony, to keep people down, to keep the world the way it is, including in ways that aren't fair. That must be your agenda. You must be a baddie because you've got the facts, and the facts are about something that brooks no contradiction whatsoever. And so you have the settled question, the fallacy of equal knowledge, and then the fallacy of, frankly, it's not just known intent, but evil intent. Those three things operating. And the problem with today's, what I call elect, is that there is no moving them past this settled question fallacy. We're dealing with a kind of person who is not open to any kind of debate about this particular sense that the power is everything and demands our full attention above and beyond anything else that we might distract ourselves with. And the question as to why people would wish to think of society in that way is a rich one. It depends on what color you are, for one thing. But a lot of it is, frankly, among the white ones, fear. I think it's very clear among many that the idea in today's society, at least in American society, and I think Canada and others as well, the idea of being called a racist in public is so frightening that it will make you do things that are not honest to yourself. And that in itself is a sign of progress. That wouldn't have been true 30 years ago, certainly not 50, but not even 30 years ago were people that afraid of being called a racist. It's progress that racism is seen as such an evil. It's not a bad thing in itself, but a negative byproduct of it is that many people walk in fear of being called a racist, and not just for job security, but because it's practically the equivalent of being called a pedophile. And as a result, a lot of people cluster into this obsessive relationship towards battling power differentials over being, frankly, an entire human being, out of fear of being called a dirty name, especially with the hegemony of social media. Then there's also a powerful thrill in thinking of yourself as having a higher wisdom. It's certainly part of being an academic in general to feel that you have a knowledge to share with people that they might enjoy and even benefit from. And so if you have a sense that all of this craziness in society can be reduced to white power, and it's a white power that needs to be interrogated and dismantled, if everything comes down to that, well, you've got a solution. There's an obvious analogy to religion. You've got the good word. That feels good. Human beings embrace having that sense of things. I'll bet all of us do about one thing or another. I do about the joys of linguistics and trying to spread them around. That's natural. And so that drives these people. It's also good to have a sense of group membership. And then all of this is sealed by the way social media puts us into self-reinforcing ideological bubbles. So we're up against people who believe this. Whatever words they use, what's going on is this particular obsession of theirs. They have a completely different sense of what it is to be a thinking person than we do. And what it means is this: to address this problem in our society, and I'm not chiding, I'm hardly in a position to do so, but I think that to address the problem of this kind of person and their increasing stranglehold on academia, on the arts, on even judicial philosophy and the media, to address this kind of person as trying to muzzle free speech or as saying that they're illiberal is not as constructive as we might think. I think it's missing what they're thinking and also threatening to confuse us a little bit in what we do about people like that. And I say that for a few reasons. One of them is this: none of us are in favor of completely free speech. I'm certainly not, and I openly admit it. We want a lot of free speech, but as other people have said, most recently in my presence, Stanley Fish, there's never been a true commitment to free speech among most of us. Most of us do not want to have discussions about whether slavery is a good thing, whether genocide is a good thing, whether women should be denied the suffrage. Talk about free speech. There's also the fact that all of us only live about 82 years and there's only so much time. There's certain things that we're not going to talk about. There's certain things that we really don't want to hear. So none of us are committed to completely free speech. The issue is how much, how many topics, and for what reason are going to be banned. And the kind of person that we're dealing with has a different sense of what should be free speech than we do. None of us believe in, or I'm presuming that none of us believe in completely free speech in practice. The issue is that these people have decided that zones of discussion should not be up for free speech beyond the ones that we have always thought were not up for being treated as free speech. And so we say to them, we have views about race, we have views about sex and gender, we have views about power that are different from yours. Let us express ourselves. Stop trying to get people unemployed for saying what they think. Let us all speak and have a discussion. To them, that's like saying, let us discuss pedophilia. Literally, I don't mean that for the rhetorical snap of it. For them, to discuss racism and sexism and things like this in any way other than what they feel is significantly in the battle position is sinful. It's the analogy of sinful. It's as if other people were telling us to think of pedophilia as an option up on the table. More, we often feel that they're trying to control language. And I know some of you may be thinking I'm going to discuss that because I'm a linguist, but I think that overshoots what's actually going on, or maybe undershoots. If you told any of them, you're trying to control how people talk, they wouldn't recognize themselves in the description. Now, that doesn't cover everything, but the reason they wouldn't recognize themselves in the description is because how they feel is that they're trying to control how we talk about something of central moral urgency. And their feeling is that if we talk about it in certain ways, we are contravening this battle that all people who are concerned with humanity must join. So I don't think most of them care that much about language per se. They don't give very much evidence of thinking about language in a philosophical sense. But for them, to be told why are you trying to control language would be as if many of us met, sorry to keep harping on this category, but I think it's a perfect analogy. Many of us met a pedophile who said, why can't I call it dating the younger? And then we say, no, we're going to call it pedophilia for what it is. Why are you euphemizing? Why can't I call it dating the younger? No. And if that person said, who are you to control language? Well, that's how these people feel about how the rest of us try to talk about these sorts of matters. And so the issue is not people who don't understand free speech. They think they do. They just figure that they want to draw the lines differently than the rest of us. It's not people trying to control language because they don't care about language. They care about power. And the two are not the same thing. You see various manifestations, but there's an underlying explanation here, which is the fist shaking at the power. Linguistic analogy in terms of the underlying explanation. Those two verbs, lie and lay. that are so hard to keep apart. One of them takes an object, one of them doesn't. Lie, lay. Okay, that's a fact in isolation. It's difficult. Now, you might also think about rise and raise. Something rises. If you make it rise, you raise it. Okay, well, there's one. You don't usually think about it when you think of lie and lay, nor do you think about the fact that you can either drink something, or if you make somebody drink something, then you drench them. Okay, that's three isolated things about the English language. To me, they're all the same thing. All of them are a vowel roughly here, E, that goes to A. So lie, lay, rise, raise, drink, drench. That's how English used to work more systematically. And there are a bunch of pairs like that. So the issue is not lie and lay is strange and raise and rise is cute and drink and drench is obscure. They're all the same thing. In the same way here, I think that the power battling essence is central to how these people think. And it's quite antithetical to what most of us think of as inquiry. But that is the nature of the battle, not them not understanding free speech, not them not having read John Stuart Mill. It's not that. And so I think that in trying to grapple with this kind of person, to the extent that you can get through to them, telling them to stop controlling language and to understand the nature of free speech isn't constructive. I think we have to more directly say to people like this, we do not share your sense of, for example, battling racism as central to everything that we do. We feel that battling racism is one of 7 or 8 things that one might do as an inquiring person, as an academic person, as someone running an institution of learning. It's one of many things, not 100 things, but about 7 or 8. We do not think that everything should be focused on that. We understand that you do, but we're not going to be swayed by your claim that making it central is the only way to not be a racist person. You have to tell the person, no, we don't share that. Now, the issue of where they draw the line in free speech and how they wish things to be talked about, all that is carried along in telling people like this that the issue is not free speech, it's your sense of battling power versus ours and its centrality. And that may take a certain bravery, because who wants to think, I'm not committed to fighting the power as what everything must be about. That's somewhat sobering. There's a little part of me that thinks, does that make me a racist? Does that make me part of the problem? And the truth is that a mature sense of what it is to live in a complex society with a long history is that injustice has happened, injustice continues to happen, but for everything to be about the injustice is not the way any society could meaningfully or even productively function. And there's something a little bit sad in that. There's what many people would call a certain tragedy in it. However, I'm not sure that there's any way beyond it. And what that means is that a certain kind of person needs to be told that your interesting idea that we really can't do anything else until we battle the power and completely change the operations of society and how people think. Interesting idea, but we don't agree and we're not going to pretend to. And you're going to have to go elsewhere if that's the way you insist things be done. People like that need to be told, if that's the way you feel, you can't use the resources of our institution to try to exert your own hegemony. You're going to have to go found your own, and we might even help you do it. But you can't do that with us. And the truth is that not only is that hard because it makes you face something about yourself, but people like that, when confronted that directly, will resist rhetorically, especially with social media. You're going to get called names personally, and institutions will be outed, so to speak, as racist and bigoted and backwards, etc. There's going to be a lot of squid ink when you offend a person of this kind. And the truth is, talk about sad. One of the saddest things about our moment at this point is that I think that America has worked really hard at learning about the evil of racism, and racism is evil, and not only eliminating formalized segregation, but learning to look inward. People don't talk about this explicitly much, but the 70s and the 80s were about America learning that even internal racist bias is an evil thing. I think it's getting to the point where you have to be of a certain age to remember when that was not living room assumed in America. But something happened, and it informed the way today people are so desperately afraid not to be called racists. As I said, that's a good thing in some ways. But now the same people who went through that or their equivalent have another task, which is to understand that a certain kind of person is going to call you all sorts of names for not being with their particular narrow program, and that to the extent that you can, you just have to withstand it. And if our academic institutions in particular are going to survive, and I'm beginning to think that they're not, then there needs to be a mechanism via which administrators and professors can withstand calls to live in this strange perversion of Orwell that we're being demanded to, and be called names and watch the institution be called names, and just stand firm and let these people pass by, but not let them take over the whole show. Because that's frankly what I'm seeing. Linguistics has become a field where I am afraid to urge my undergraduates to join it. And I feel terrible about that, but it's at the point where the only undergraduates I encourage to become linguists are ones who I know would not do anything that would offend this new hyper woke sort of sentiment, or the ones who I can tell wouldn't mind being called names. But frankly, that's not most people. And that's a sad thing, because I know I'm not alone in being an academic of a certain age who's beginning to realize that he could not or she could not morally bring an intelligent young person into the field, because not only would they probably not get a job unless they had a very narrow power battling focus, which usually is but 1/200th of what the field's purview is, but they're going to get their feelings hurt if they try to do anything different. You don't want to send somebody into the maw of a beast. That's not the way it should be. But what it means is that we have to understand that what would maul these students is not an inattendance to the nature of free speech or an obsession with controlling how people talk and write. It's about this relationship to power, as abstract as that must seem. And this is a beast. This is a tough one, because we're talking about very smart, articulate, poised people. And like all of us, they're fish who don't know they're wet. They don't know that their settled question isn't settled, and they'll never know. And so that is what is among us these days. So I think that the idea that inquiry must be advocacy is an understandable feeling, but it's also a very narrow one. And I don't think we can make our way through the people who operate under this impression unless we fully understand what the nature of the conflict is. And it's less about John Stuart Mill than it's about how you feel about the urgency of battling differentials in power. That's what we're about. That's what confuses me. That's what confounds me. But I've tried my best to make sense of it. And that's what I've tried to share with you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. When I get to the airport on Monday and I'm late, I can tell the airline that John McWhorter says punctuality is racist, and therefore they should wait for me.
It's getting to that point.
I have a serious question, however. When you were talking about the motivation of the people that basically run the woke agenda, you essentially presuppose that they are genuine, that they are genuinely. My experience from growing up in East Germany suggests that amongst those people, there may be some that really are genuine, but there are also quite a few that have figured out if I do anything differently, I get into trouble, and therefore they just speak the words, do the deeds, but they don't really believe in all of that stuff. And the way the wall finally came down in East Germany was that there was kind of like a critical mass of people saying we just had enough of it. And all of a sudden, those people that really weren't fully in, we called them Wendehals. This is a bird that like changes his neck according to the wind. All of those people, all of a sudden, they were on board. So do you think that like within this community of the woke, there are a lot of people that just kind of like swim along, or the majority is like really, really vested in it. Any idea what the...
Yeah, it's what you describe. It's ominously similar. The people who cannot be reached about this and are the ringleaders and are the most vocal are true believers. There are certainly people who really do believe this kind of thing and are utterly impenetrable. The result is that probably the mass of people just learn to keep their heads down. And so you can find in conversations with them that they understand that there's something wrong. They'll roll their eyes, they'll talk about how things are extreme, but they would never do anything to interrupt any of this. They would never offend any of the vocal people. They would never write anything that would go against the orthodoxy. And so, whether or not they really believe it comes out in the wash, they end up creating part of the reality. And one thing that I know about social history, and maybe there is only one thing, is that what creates change is often something that isn't predictable. I mean, nobody could have predicted the racial reckoning of 2020. That was a cocktail of many things that came together, including the pandemic and the nature of George Floyd's murder, et cetera. I think it's going to take something rather unpredictable for a critical mass of people, especially in academia, to say, okay, enough of this. This is no longer making sense. I'm not afraid anymore. It's time to start getting honest. I can't say what that would be. And I think that having discussions about it honestly is part of that. But there would need to be something that changed things unexpectedly, rather as was the case with the Berlin Wall. Nobody could have known exactly when that was going to happen. But frankly, I'm hoping that something along those lines goes on in academia, because it's becoming unrecognizable as what I knew. And I hate to say that I'm not being rhetorical when I say that. It's chilling.
Right, I mean, in East Germany, the problem was that from above we were told what we could not say, and in academia now it's that the students ask for more restrictions of what we actually can inquire about, and this kind of takes into account what you said about the woke agenda or the other, more just being curious. But
go ahead.
No, I just pass on the microphone to the next person who wants to ask a question.
I thank you for that, and I think I agree with your thesis, but I'm trying to square the circle on your observations about what you think should be allowed to be said and not said. So you referred to the fellow who comes along and wants to make a case for pedophilia or cannibalism or something that is socially unacceptable. And I'm just trying to understand if you mean to say that that's the line that you would draw in terms of the limits of free speech. If somebody comes along and wants to write a piece or give a lecture on cannibalism, that they should not be allowed to do so? I mean, hopefully they would get no audience, or no one would publish it in the paper. But are we saying that the law should say, well, you're not allowed to go to the park and get on the park bench and make a speech about cannibalism? Is that really what you mean?
No, I don't think that it should be against the law to get on a park bench and make a speech in favor of cannibalism. I don't think it should be against the law to, I don't know why you have to climb up on the park bench, but climb up on the bench and make an argument for slavery. Frankly, the world would keep spinning and very, very few people would be swayed. It gets to the point where if a person expressed a view, it would have so little effect that you could have a confident sense that societies do, even if lurchingly, have moral and intellectual development. So I wouldn't say that these things should not be done. However, I would say that, and this is a where do you draw the line, but there's a sense that I think civilized people would have that some things are more worthy of debate than others. And most people wouldn't want to sit in a seminar room and spend the time that would be required arguing whether or not genocide is a good thing, whereas that may have actually been a viable argument in many cases 500 years ago among our antecedents. But now I think we've kind of gotten past it. But no, anything should be allowed to be discussed. But I think in reality, certain things will not be, if that makes any sense.
Awesome, thank you. Next.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That talk is very informative. You said that this is not about controlling language for these people. It's about that they want to control power, which I agree completely. But I do want to talk about the postmodern idea, and specifically the poststructuralist idea that language controls power. And starting from, I think the French feminists started it in the 70s, where there was the idea that we actually have to change words, change the spelling of words. You see that with women. You change the use of language, don't capitalize anything, because you can smash the patriarchy by not using capitals, and capitalism. So, it's really starting to channel down through society. Like women are now being referred to as persons with uteruses, or persons with V's, or menstruators. I've seen some American politicians call us that. In Canada, we also have compelled speech with regards to the trans issue. Like you must use certain pronouns, and if you don't, it's hate speech, and you can be criminalized for that, or it's a criminal offense. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, and how this, I guess, changing of language actually does affect society and how people are perceived. And I think they're not wrong in doing that, and it's malicious, and it's wrong-headed, and I think it's a the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of situation. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an important question. I think there's certainly room for changing the way that we talk about things in order to help nudge thought along. Although, as Steven Pinker actually came up with long before me, although I always like to spread it around, if the negative ideas are still there, they'll catch up with whatever new terms there are. And I think that ultimately there is a hyper focus on changing language these days that just bypasses in degree what a society actually needs, when what we're really trying to do is change thought. And it can be almost difficult to imagine that there wouldn't be this incredible focus on capitalization and terminology and the way you put things, and enslaved person instead of slave, et cetera. But I imagine how, for example, here in the United States, how earlier civil rights leaders would have felt about this laser focus on how we say things. It wouldn't have made any sense, for example, to Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King wasn't 500 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And yet that wasn't what people did. And I think that there's something to be said for their focus on changing the way things were rather than the way people talk about things. And I must admit that, frankly, I think that the obsession among many of these people with language is partly because that's easy. It's easy to say person without a home, or person without shelter, rather than homeless person, as opposed to actually going out and formulating the kinds of policies that keep people off of the streets at night, et cetera. And so some of it, I think, is a little bit lazy and self-indulgent. The personal is political can be misused, essentially. But there's something to it. I mean, it wasn't crazy for Black people in America to call for being called African American. I never liked it, but I understood what was behind it. It wasn't a bad thing. But there's an issue of degree. And I think that the hyper woke left these days goes further than truly makes any sense. And oddly, for reasons I don't understand, from what I see, that is more extreme in Canada than in the United States. I don't know what makes that difference, but it really seems to have taken a hold there.
Yeah, you give us a lot to think about there. I guess what I'm finding difficult here is how to square what you've said about the proponents of critical race theory and the impression I've formed given my readings in critical race theory, which would include people like Robin DiAngelo and Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones and colleagues, Desmond Martin, I think it is, or Morton, and Derek Bell, and all these people. I'm also thinking too of criticisms of them that you get from Shelby Steele, whom you have declared enormous respect for, but who I think sees the problem differently, as do people like Lindsay and Pluckrose in their book Cynical Theories, for example. For them, I think it is much more of an issue of Mill versus Marx/Foucault than it does seem to be for you. That for the most rigorous proponents of critical race theory, the root idea here is a systemic racism. And systemic racism, in their view, seems to be a kind of racialized capitalism. Capitalism is basically evil, and if you add to that racism, you compound the evil. But what that suggests is that the system as a whole, even the liberal democratic society system as a whole, is evil. So that the attempt to defend liberal democratic society by appealing to the rights of free speech and freedom of religion and equality before the law, for these people, all of that kind of speech is part of the whole racist thing that they're battling. So they really do present themselves fundamentally as anti-liberal, as opposed to just occupying a different free speech zone, it seems to me. And that's why I wonder whether what we don't have to do is to continue to defend liberal democratic society and its principles in ways that show that what they're talking about represents the opposite. That really they're talking about massive government engineered social engineering programs, possibly even transforming liberal democratic society into some version of, woke-led socialism or something like that. I wonder if you could just respond.
You and I completely agree. I mean, on a different day, I would have put it the way that you put it. I would only say that I think part of standing firm against people like this is therefore to say, we defend liberal democracy. We know that you think of it as an inherently racist experiment, but the solutions that you propose, the way you would rather run society, would actually not be good for human beings either. And I think often you would just say that it's rather underthought. Most of those people are not exactly strong on policy. And then defend that the way we do things, despite its imperfections, is not the evil that you claim. That would be the idea if you were really going to get down to cases with people like this. And so it would be along those lines. And that I'm putting that as they have a different sense of free speech in that, of course, why are you going to speak freely about things that really just uphold what is fundamentally a racist idea? And I think that's quite rational, but you have to fight them where they live, which is, yes, their basic idea that illiberalism is progressive, that they have the next word, they have the higher wisdom. We have to confront them about that, and especially by saying that we have solutions that you don't, as opposed to this Orwellian society that I think a lot of those people think they would prefer, although my impression is generally that they're not thinking that hard about the way they'd like things to go. They just want to overthrow the racist patriarchy first. But yeah, what you said, I agree. I think we're applying different terms to things to an extent.
So just going back to the response you gave 2 questions ago, I was wondering if you could speak to whether in the evolution of language, there has ever been an example of someone inorganically changing language and having it stick. So not letting that process evolve on its own, but actually doing what's happening now, which is saying you must use this word, you can't use this word. Has that ever worked and stuck?
No. To my knowledge, I mean, new words can nudge thought along, but that's about the best that it can be. I mean, having respect for people who have bodily disablements, cripple took on a certain sense, and so that word was dismissed and people said handicap. That's better than cripple, but then people started having the same association with handicap and then came disabled. That's the nature of the system. I am aware, and of course I haven't checked every historical situation in every language, but I'm not aware of language changing how people thought by fiat in that way. I also know that it's very easy to imagine that it could be that way, especially if you've studied up on your Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and you fall for the interesting but overhyped idea that the way your language's vocabulary and grammar is structured gives you a certain worldview. A lot of these people are basing their ideas on that. I happen to have written a whole book against that whole idea. I was not thinking about the hyper woke when I wrote it, but a lot of them are thinking along those lines. No, it never works. That's not the way language and thought are related, and that's not the way social history progresses, at least to anything I've ever seen.
Just an insert on that from the experience growing up in East Germany. So we really had this involuntary experiment where we shared the language with the evil West Germans, and over the 40 years that the countries were actually divided, there were very few words, maybe a handful, that took on a different meaning in East and West Germany. But of course, by the time the wall came down, this kind of got absorbed again. So it really doesn't seem to be the case that this kind of like we ran a big experiment with that. So it wasn't just like a few. We were 17 million in East Germany, and it really didn't catch on those phrases that they wanted us to use. And
Christina, it's not all about me, but just because I'd like to know, what's one example of that? Do you remember of one of these terms or words?
For instance, like collective. So in East Germany, collective was considered to be a group of people that had the same ideas, the same goals, and that kind of stuff. In West Germany, it was just a random group of people that came together for whatever purpose. And so this politicizing was in East German saying that collective was a good thing, a better thing, kind of like the woke people that want to change everything. But that completely disappeared again, so it's...
Of course.
Hi, long-time listener, first-time caller. I've got a question about vocabulary again, about the word racist, and I want to give you the context for it. So grew up understanding it as just individual, bigotry, and then understood the idea of systemic racism. And recently in Ontario, we had a new draft legislation called Racial Equity in the Education System, written by an anti-racist activist. And she wrote a definition that really perplexed me, and I wanted your help in trying to make sense of it. So there's two definitions, one of anti-racism and then one of racism, and they're not connected. I'm just going to read you the anti-racism definition. She says it means the policy of opposing racism, including anti-indigenous racism, anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. Now, that seems incoherent to me. Now I don't understand what the word racist means, because that could be Islamophobic. If you're Islamophobic, are you racist? I don't think I know what the word means anymore, and I need your help.
It's obviously there's a slip between that word and its original meaning and what certain people's agenda is. And obviously the idea is, and I know I've gotten monotonous on this, but it's about white people and the feelings that they have about subaltern groups. And the whole issue of what a race is becomes rather abstract. The idea is that thing that white people do wrong, whiteness, and combating it. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether you're really talking about religion. It could be that, white people decide not to like one-legged people from Nevada. That would be called racism too. That's what it would be. Sorry to keep being so United States centric. Suppose I said one-legged person from Saskatchewan. That's there. But I think that's what it is, and it just extends. And so these people don't mean racism in any sense that anybody from 1968 would have recognized. And racism's become a really tough word. It's kind of like dating. Like, they dated. That means so many things. It's an almost useless word. It could mean holding hands. It could mean practically being married. They dated. Racism is becoming that large in terms of what it means. Part of being an informed person these days, an informed North American, is to understand all of these manifestations and know that we've come a long way from it being about bigotry, that we're talking about something much larger, something much more abstract. But it can be frustrating.
Thank you, Dr. McWhorter. My name is Rhoda Hassman, and this is not my field at all. I work on international human rights and comparative genocide studies. So one of the things I've noticed about this is people's unwillingness to actually confront reality. Take, for example, cannibalism, which was practiced by starving people in the Ukraine during the Soviet famine, which was practiced in the 90s and perhaps even in our century by starving people in North Korea. People don't want to hear about it. People advise me not to talk about it in my books, but I do. Same thing with a lot of this diversity stuff. I don't know if you remember a South African anti-apartheid writer named Ruth First, who was murdered. And she wrote a book called Power Comes Out of the Barrel of a Gun. Now, if I try to tell my diversity colleagues that there are people who are being killed in South America, for example, because they're indigenous, and they don't have the right of free speech, they don't have the right to say what they want without being tortured, murdered, raped, and so on, all my diversity colleagues want to do is talk about the power of language in Canada. So what I see is an enormous naivete and unwillingness to confront the actual real evils that are going on in the rest of the world, which is not to say I deny the evil of racism. I've been reading stuff and writing stuff about racism for 50 years. But there's an actual naivete, unwillingness to face what's going on in the world. That's just a comment.
That thing that you see, where there's that numbness to other kinds of injustice because it doesn't fit the paradigm, is why I call, and notice I've barely used this framing of it today, but why I call this frame of mind a religion, in that it's stunning to see people so uninterested in certain kinds of suffering because it doesn't fit a certain narrative that they prefer. And I think that that goes beyond what we can call strictly rational. And it means that we're facing something that is more a creed. It's a visceral sense of identity that goes beyond using logic from A to B to C. And in the reception of my book, Woke Racism, I think one of the main criticisms has been that people are uncomfortable with that religious analogy. And I say about half of that resistance is from people who don't like that it's rather clear from my book that I'm no fan of religion. And I understand that. That means it feels personal to them. I would feel the same way. But then for some people, they just don't understand why I call it a religion rather than an ideology. But the sort of thing that you're describing for me goes beyond ideology. It's something that seems almost heartlessly irrational unless you think of it as going beyond reason. And yeah, I know what you mean. I have seen equivalent things in my own field, and I have heard other people talk about that kind of thing. They only want to talk about the one thing, and they can't even hear you when you're talking about the suffering of real people. Yeah, it's hard.
Are there more questions? Okay, I think we all agree that was a really, really fascinating talk, and I think we also all agree that, especially for somebody like yourself, it takes probably a huge amount of courage to speak out in the way you do, because like by default you are assumed to be on the side of the oppressed and all of that, and if one of the people that are pigeonholed in that position actually say, no, by the way, I have a different opinion, then they are really criticized even more harshly than if a white person would say what you say. I have heard you being called kind of like white on the inside and stuff like that. And so I really, really want to say how much we appreciate that you actually speak out in the way you do, and we just all wish you the best.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to keep speaking. Definitely. Thank you.